What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 113 days now, going up to 365. And in today's video, I'm going to be going through my production flywheel in terms of how I'm thinking about this and how I'm also implementing it. So if we jump straight into it, we can see that it all starts from production, where this is basically the output that I want to have, and through this output, then I'm then able to systemize this output by creating workflows and processes that ultimately make it more efficient. And through this systemization of this production that I ultimately want to have, then that ultimately is prepped for scale. And through this prep for scale, that then ultimately feeds into me being able to solve harder problems, because if I'm then able to create this systemization of this production that I'm actively having, then that ultimately frees up time and mental bandwidth as well. That ultimately allows me to solve harder and harder problems, because the systems are just super dialed in terms of the output that I ultimately have. And through this process, then ultimately repeating it, so it's as a loop, is basically a flywheel, where we're basically repeating and looping the system, where basically we have the production system and then ultimately prepping that for scale, then ultimately solving the harder problems. And then if we dive a lot deeper, which I like to think about in different layers, which is the daily layer, the weekly layer, and the monthly layer, we can then go more into more detail in terms of how it is ultimately governed by the outputs. So if we take a look at the daily layer, we can see the outputs are daily videos, outreach, so basically reaching out to people in terms of how we're pitching our services and ultimately what we're doing. So these are the daily outputs that I ultimately want to have, which are the production, what I want to produce, which are basically the daily videos, these videos as well, and ultimately the tasks completed or slash client builds that we ultimately shipped. So these are the desired outputs that I ultimately want to have. And then through this, we ultimately also have signals. So these are ultimately what is formed as a result of these outputs, which are consistency and proof of work. Because if we're then able to build this on a day-to-day basis, then we're then able to be consistent and also have proof of work. Because if we're reaching out to clients each and every single day to work with us, then we're ultimately building that moat that ultimately compounds, and ultimately that compounding leverage that ultimately is formed through that is a testament to our proof of work that we are ultimately having, whether it's a task completed or just shipping new products for our clients. It ultimately results in us taking a look at the daily layer and how that ultimately feeds into producing a lot more. Because one of the main things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how can I focus on just producing. Because I think in as much as you can consume, I think production is the number one mode that I ultimately want to make sure that I'm driving for myself and for the team as well. Because in as much as we can think about producing and layering in different steps, I think production is the number one mode that ultimately drives how we're then able to create value. Because if you look at real world businesses and all the businesses that are successful, you can see that the number one thing that ultimately they do is produce. Whether it's a service or a product, they're constantly in production mode. And I also want to take a little nugget from this and just constantly be in production mode. So how can we think about this in layers? Like I always like to think about things in different layers, in terms of how can we think about the layers and then peel back off on those layers and ultimately understand it at a far deeper level. And through this, that ultimately means that we're then setting non-negotiable reps. So basically setting non-negotiable things that we need to do on a day-to-day, which ultimately builds that consistency and proof of work as well. And also building the volume and clarity here, because the more volume that we ultimately have, the sharper clarity we're then able to form in terms of our pitch, and also how we're able to then communicate the value of what it is that we're building in terms of systems as well. Because I think, like Nate Nate said in yesterday's video, you ultimately get clarity as a result of outputting a ton of volume. Like for example, with these daily videos, if I started, breaking these daily videos into 1 week apart, that ultimately wouldn't have led into the level of clarity that I do have today, and the shorter time frame that I've been able to gather this level of clarity. And then asking the question of how can I then incorporate some of these lessons into what we're doing on a daily layer, on a deeper level, which is the daily, the weekly, and the monthly layer, and basically being able to understand it at a far deeper level. And then if we dig a lot deeper into the weekly layer, we can see how the output that we need to ultimately have, as an example for this, is ultimately one new system slash process documented, which then becomes a playbook, a SOP, or a template, so that each and every single month we're ultimately bringing new SOPs and playbooks that ultimately govern how we're then able to build better and better systems into the future, because you're always constantly learning and you're always constantly gathering new insights. So you ultimately need to make sure that we're thinking on a weekly layer of how can we have a new playbook, how can we have a new documentation of a SOP that we can ultimately have, that ultimately governs how we're then able to produce a lot more. Because in as much as you can produce, I think having a structured approach to this and also documenting is also super important. For example, with these daily videos, you can just post daily videos each and every single day, but if you're not building SOPs in the sense that how are you actively shipping these daily videos in a manner that is structured and also makes sense, then you're not ultimately pushing a lot further. Because I think in as much as we can build a lot of things, we also need to make sure that we're documenting as well. And this also comes as a result, of us thinking about one new asset created, whether it's a landing page, a pitch deck, or even a case study or a new automation. What are the things that we're ultimately, shipping on a week-to-week basis that ultimately allows us to move in from the, consumption mode into the production? Because I want us to spend a lot more time in the production mode and just, producing a lot more and failing through that. And failing through that ultimately allows us to rapidly iterate on the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis and a week-to-week basis, because we're constantly learning things that we're failing at and also improving at. And through failing and succeeding as well, we're then able to build the documentation that ultimately powers how we're learning and moving into the future. But that ultimately means that the signals that we're actively seeking from this is ultimately iteration velocity. How can we increase the velocity in terms of how we're iterating this, and also having benchmarks for this, to basically saying, hey, if we're having a 1 week iteration cycle, how can we then shorten this into a 3-day iteration cycle? Basically shortening the cycle and also being able to track those metrics is one of the most important signals when it comes to the weekly layer as well. And also the efficiency increasing. How efficient are we getting in terms of streamlining our SOPs, our documentations, and even the assets that we're then able to create internally and externally as well? How are we then able to reflect and also iterate on these specific metrics that govern how we're then able to also increase the velocity and also increase the efficiency? Because if we don't have that data, then the following week we're going to be scratching our heads, in the sense that we're not going to know what it is that we need to improve on a day-to-day basis. And also understanding that one of the most important things as well is ultimately understanding the metrics. The deeper and deeper we can understand the metrics, the further we can get, because we can then have those data points that ultimately allow us to refine the processes that we need to refine in terms of our client builds and also internal builds as well. And through that is where production compounds into leverage, because one of the most important modes as well is ultimately moving this production of shipping each and every single day, or just producing a lot more value into this compounding leverage that ultimately drives how we're then able to create value. Because the further and further we're then able to compound this production quadrant that we're actively looking at and also doing, then we're then able to create the value that we are seeking to ultimately achieve. And through this we then move into the monthly layer. And how we're thinking about this monthly layer is ultimately having this in the sense that we're solving one harder problem, which is an example of this, which is build a growth system, whether it's building an entire growth system within that month, or restructuring an offer, or landing a higher ticket client. It's ultimately focusing a lot more on solving one harder problem than we did last month. And how can we actively do this? We need to make sure that we're documenting this as well, and just producing a lot more, because through production then we're then able to understand where the leaks are, and that ultimately allows us to then even figure out what the harder problem that we need to solve is, just by getting more skin in the game. And that ultimately also comes in us understanding that we need to make sure that we're adding one major system slash automation that permanently reduces workload, basically looking internally and externally and asking the question of how can we remove this stage or this process permanently, and create a workflow around this that ultimately allows us to become more efficient on a permanent basis long term. And asking those questions ultimately allows us to then deep dive into the things that we're building on that specific within that specific month, and then ultimately allows us to refine, because the deeper we get, the more we understand in terms of data, in terms of metrics as well. And through this we're then able to understand what the harder problem is that we need to solve, and that ultimately then allows us to then create a solution for it. But this ultimately comes as a result as well, if we look at these daily videos, of publishing one flagship piece, whether it's deep dive content or a case study or specific framework that we've ultimately been able to curate throughout the month, that ultimately it will play a vital role into us moving into the future, is also super important. So it's about thinking about this in 3 different layers and understanding how each layer interacts with each other, and thinking about this in terms of the signals that it also produces, in terms of the strategic breakthroughs that ultimately come as a result of this, and also the higher level positioning, basically focusing on how can we position ourselves to be the number one authority within the specific niche and specific service that we're providing. And that ultimately comes as a result of us facing or having this approach of how can we solve a harder problem this specific month, and how can we build one major system that ultimately results in us permanently deleting a specific work flow that we ultimately had that was done manually, or even just having one flagship piece, basically a piece of content that ultimately acts as a bridge, or creates a deeper authority that we're actively striving for. And that ultimately comes as a result of asking these questions on a month to month basis. But that ultimately means that we need to make sure that we're zooming out and asking the question of, am I solving a bigger problem than last month? Am I solving a problem that is bigger than I did last month? And how am I actively measuring that as well? Because you can solve different problems and you can solve hard problems, but if you're not extracting the lessons as well as the data from those lessons that you've had, then you're not then gonna understand how you're gonna move to solve an even harder problem, because you're not gonna have that information and you're not gonna have those data points. My personal belief in that realm, that ultimately allows you to then create and solve harder and harder problems. But this ultimately acts as a flywheel, in the sense of what is the actual flywheel this actively consists of. And this flywheel means that we're looking at it from a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, and this is ultimately a compounding mode, basically looking at the flywheel of how can we look at it from a daily perspective, where we're focusing on energy and volume. How can we then have enough energy and volume as well to be doing this on a day-to-day basis? And how can we then have this on a weekly basis as well, where we're basically looking at the systems and structure of those systems. How can we then iterate on these structures and systems that we have on a week to week basis? And through that then we do audits, basically monthly impact breakthroughs, basically what level of impact did we have on that specific month, and how can we use the data points from that specific month in order to help us to solve harder and harder problems. and also use this as a compounding mode that ultimately, is a brick into the foundation for what it is that we're building, and ultimately, showcasing those breakthroughs as well. And I know that this flywheel is ultimately going to allow us, to move a lot further into the production in terms of, how we're producing, how we're thinking about producing, how we're also implementing different procedures in terms of our, production quadrant, and just focusing a lot more on production. Because I think the number one thing that, I'm actively focusing on now, and that ultimately creates a ton of value, is ultimately producing. And how can we produce on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and a monthly basis? And how are we strategically thinking about this, and also making sure that we're not getting lost in terms of what we're building, and we're keeping focus as well, and having this focus structured down into solving these hard problems, and understanding that we're documenting this as well, and also making sure that we have one major system that we're removing from our workflow, from the weekly data points that we've been able to gather, that ultimately allows us to scale the level of impact that we have into the future. And if you guys enjoyed this video, it was a really fun video to dive a lot deeper into, and I probably will make another part 2 where I'll just dive a lot deeper in terms of, how I'm actively thinking about this on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, that how I'm actively, also peeling back the layers in terms of the questions that I'm actively asking as well, because questions are also super important in terms of digging a lot deeper. And the number one thing that I want to do is ultimately, be structured in the sense that I'm structured and just, producing a lot more than I'm consuming, because I think that is the number one mode that will ultimately get us to our grand vision in terms of, building a lot more, and just building, and not just focusing so much on consumption. And I made a previous video on this, where basically I went through when to know when to stop consuming and when to start building. And right now we're just in that build phase, where we're just hitting a lot of things, or throwing a lot of things in the wall, and trying to see what works and what doesn't work, so that we can ultimately, run with what does work. And yeah, like I said, if you guys want to connect with me, make sure to check my X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and also make sure to check out my newsletter, which I recently just rolled out. Link is the first one in the description to the newsletter, and make sure to join, where I'll be breaking down, high level systems and the lessons and failures that I've had as well, at a much deeper level than I am doing on these daily videos, and also in a different format. So yeah, like I said, if you guys want to connect with me, check out my socials, and also check out the newsletter as well, where I'm going to be diving a lot deeper into topics just like this on a weekly basis. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, I will see you guys in the next one.